The morning I discovered my husband had emptied our joint account, he was standing in the kitchen making coffee and humming quietly to himself, like a man without a single thing to hide. I had only checked the balance by accident, a routine notification on my phone while I was getting ready for work. The number I saw made me read it 3 times before my brain accepted it was real. Not a banking error, not a pending transaction, just zero. Completely, cleanly, deliberately zero. 15 years of shared savings, gone in what the transaction history showed as a single transfer processed 4 days earlier, on a Wednesday afternoon, while I was sitting in a quarterly review meeting and Marcus was supposedly at the university teaching a graduate seminar on structural design. I remember standing in our bathroom with that notification still glowing on my screen, listening to him hum downstairs, and feeling something shift inside me that I can only describe as a door closing very quietly in a very large house. Not panic, not rage, something much colder and much more permanent than either of those things. I put my phone in my bag, went downstairs, kissed him on the cheek the way I always did, poured my coffee, and asked what time he expected to be home for dinner. He said around 7. I said great. Then I drove to work and sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before I trusted myself to walk inside and smile at people normally. That was 4 days before our anniversary dinner. 4 days before the white lilies arrived at my office with a card that was not from Marcus. 4 days before everything I had quietly suspected for 18 months finally stepped out of the shadows and introduced itself properly. The lilies were from a woman named Dana, who had been Marcus's graduate research assistant for 2 years, and apparently believed I already knew about their arrangement. Her card said only, "Wishing you both well in whatever comes next." She had assumed he had already told me. He had not told me anything. He had simply moved the money and ordered flowers from a florist downtown, as if 15 years deserved to be decorated before they were discarded. My coworkers gathered around my desk that morning, reading the card, touching the petals, asking what Marcus had planned for the evening. I smiled and said something about a reservation. What I actually felt, standing inside that circle of friendly faces and white flowers that smelled like a funeral, was the specific and terrible calm of a person who has just understood everything at once. And the strangest part is this: I was not even surprised. I think some part of me had known for a long time. I had just been very committed to not knowing it consciously, because knowing it consciously meant I had to do something about it. And doing something about it meant dismantling a life I had spent 15 years carefully building inside a world that belonged to Marcus and his family far more than it had ever truly belonged to me. If this story is speaking to something you recognize, stay with me. And if you want to hear how it ends, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps more than you know. There is a specific moment when trust dies inside a marriage. Not the moment you discover the lie, not even the moment you first suspect it. It is the moment you remember an earlier conversation and realize with awful clarity that the lie was already alive back then, and you were already inside it. And you smiled and said goodnight and turned off the lamp without knowing any of it. For me, that moment arrived not in our kitchen with a glowing phone screen, but in a memory of something I had almost forgotten. 18 months before the empty account and the lilies and the anniversary dinner that changed everything, I had come home early from a work trip. My flight had landed ahead of schedule, and I had not told Marcus because I wanted to surprise him with takeout from the place he loved near the harbor. The small Portuguese restaurant with the blue awning and the handwritten menus. I remember I was in a good mood. I remember the bag of food was warm against my side as I came through the back gate. Marcus was on the porch. It was a warm evening, still light, the kind of evening that feels almost unreasonably beautiful when you are happy. He was leaning against the railing with his phone to his ear, and his voice was low and careful in a way that had nothing to do with the volume and everything to do with the intention behind it. I stopped before he saw me. He said, "She still trusts me completely." Then, after a pause, "That is all we need right now." I stood on the other side of the screen door, holding warm takeout and listening to my husband discuss my trust in him like it was a resource to be managed, a buffer, a strategic advantage. I could not hear the other person's voice, but I could hear the shape of the conversation. It was not the voice of a man making a mistake. It was the voice of a man executing a plan. I went back around the front, rang the doorbell, pretended I had just arrived. Marcus opened the door, looking relaxed and warm and genuinely happy to see me, and I smiled and held up the food and said I wanted to surprise him, and he kissed me and said I absolutely did. And we sat at the kitchen table and ate together, and he told me about his day, and I told him about mine, and the whole time something very quiet and very serious was rearranging itself in the back of my mind. I did not confront him that night, not because I was afraid, because I understood in some instinctive and unarticulated way that confronting him too early would only cause him to hide things more carefully. Whatever was happening, I needed to understand its full shape before I reacted. A reaction without information is just noise. I had no interest in making noise. So I waited. And I watched. And I started paying attention to things I had allowed myself to be too comfortable to notice before. The woman my husband's mother truly was revealed itself not in any single dramatic moment, but in 100 small ones I had filed away without realizing I was building a case. Gloria Hale was 63 years old, sharp-boned and impeccably dressed. The kind of woman who made every room feel slightly like an interview. She had chaired the university's architecture faculty board for 9 consecutive years, organized 3 major regional conferences, and appeared in enough professional photographs to fill a small gallery wall. She wore her accomplishments the way other women wore jewelry, visibly, deliberately, always making sure the light caught them just right. When Marcus first introduced us, she shook my hand with both of hers, smiled warmly, and said she had heard so many wonderful things. I believed her completely. I was 29 and newly in love, and still at the age when a warm handshake from a future mother-in-law feels like acceptance rather than assessment. It took me almost a full year to understand that Gloria's warmth was not insincere exactly. It was conditional. It operated like a dimmer switch, brightest when you were useful, and fading precisely in proportion to how much of your own light you were producing independently. I worked in urban planning at the time, developing green infrastructure proposals for mid-sized cities, the kind of work that required both technical precision and the ability to argue a position clearly in rooms full of people who did not want to agree with you. I was good at it. I got better every year. And Gloria, who had built her entire identity around being the most professionally formidable woman in any room connected to Marcus, noticed that progression with the quiet attentiveness of someone watching a weather system develop offshore. She never said anything overtly unkind to me, That was never her method. Gloria operated through implication and timing, through the compliment that carried a hidden blade, through the question asked in exactly the right company to plant exactly the right doubt. At a faculty dinner early in our marriage, she once looked across the table at me and said, with every appearance of genuine curiosity, whether I ever worried that my work kept me too intellectually distracted to be fully present at home. The table smiled politely. Marcus said nothing. I answered calmly and changed the subject. But I felt the shape of it. The suggestion that a woman who thought too much about her career was somehow failing at something more important. What I understand now, that I did not fully understand then, is that Gloria had spent decades making Marcus emotionally dependent on her approval. Not through cruelty, but through consistency. She was always there, always supportive, always the one who understood him best, who saw his talent most clearly, who believed in his vision when the world was slow to catch up. She had built herself into the architecture of his confidence so completely that disagreeing with her felt to him like disagreeing with the most reliable floor beneath his feet. And so, when their interests aligned against mine, Marcus did not experience it as a choice. He experienced it as gravity. What I could not have anticipated, even after the porch conversation and the months of quiet observation that followed, was how far ahead of me they already were by the time I started paying attention. I thought I was watching them. I did not yet understand they had already been watching me. I found this out in the most ordinary way imaginable. A Wednesday afternoon, a dentist appointment that ran short, and a coffee shop I ducked into to kill 40 minutes before heading back to the office. The coffee shop sat on a corner 2 blocks from the university, all exposed brick and mismatched chairs, the kind of place that fills up with graduate students by noon. I ordered at the counter, found a table near the window, and was reading something on my phone when I heard Gloria's voice from the back of the room. She was sitting with a man I did not immediately recognize, leaning slightly forward over a small table, her voice low but carrying the way precise voices do in tiled spaces. I could not make out every word, but I heard enough. I heard the phrase, "before she realizes the full picture." I heard Marcus's name, and I heard the word timeline used the way people use it when they are talking about a sequence of events they intend to control. I did not turn around. I finished my coffee slowly. I left through the side door, and I sat in my car with my hands on the steering wheel thinking about the word timeline and what exactly they believed I had not yet realized. That evening, I came home and made dinner, and asked Marcus how his day was. He said, fine, a long faculty meeting, nothing interesting. He did not mention seeing his mother. He had not been with his mother. I already knew that. But I noted the ease of the omission, the complete absence of any hesitation, and I understood something important. Whatever they were planning, Marcus had been practicing his version of normal for a while now, and I had just run out of patience for pretending I hadn't noticed. The anniversary dinner invitation arrived 3 days later, printed on heavy cream cardstock, hand-addressed in Gloria's unmistakable angular script. The cream invitation sitting on our kitchen counter was not a celebration. It was an execution notice printed on expensive paper. I knew that the moment I read it. The Faculty Club, Saturday evening. Dinner in honor of 15 years of marriage. Gloria had even written a small note at the bottom in her careful, angular hand. A milestone worth marking properly with the people who matter most. 22 guests, colleagues, family friends, two of Marcus's senior research partners, his department chair, three couples from their country club circle. She had built an audience the way a director builds a cast, every seat filled with purpose. I set the card down on the counter and stood there for a moment, listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of traffic outside, and the specific silence of a house where something enormous is about to happen, and only one person knows it. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. Her name was Janet Reeves, and she had come recommended by a colleague who described her in exactly 4 words. She does not flinch. That turned out to be the most accurate professional description I had ever received secondhand. Janet was 51, compact and direct, with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her head like she had just paused mid-sentence to deal with you before returning to something more important. When I first walked into her office weeks earlier and laid out everything I had found, the empty account, the property venture, the coffee shop conversation, the timeline word I could not stop hearing in my memory, she listened without interrupting once. Then she asked 3 very precise questions. Then she said, "Good. Keep going." What I had built by the time the anniversary dinner invitation arrived was not dramatic. It was thorough. Printed bank statements showing the transfer and its destination account. A property registration document obtained through public records, listing the new real estate venture under Marcus's name alone, with Gloria listed as a founding co-investor. A statement from a forensic accountant who had reviewed our shared financial history and identified the moment, almost 14 months earlier, when Marcus had begun quietly redirecting portions of our joint income into a separate holding structure. Every transfer I had been flagged for in Gloria's envelope had a corresponding document showing exactly what it actually was. A consultation fee, a safety deposit box rental, a payment to Janet. Every single one legitimate, documented, time-stamped. Gloria had taken real transactions and reframed them without their context, the way you can make any sentence sound sinister if you remove the sentence before and after it. But here is what surprised me most when I understood the full shape of their plan. They were not trying to prove I was a bad person. They were trying to create enough confusion in that room, enough reasonable doubt, enough social discomfort that Marcus could position himself as the wronged party before the property venture became public. They needed me to look unstable or dishonest just long enough for the narrative to set like concrete. After that, anything I said would sound like damage control. It was, I had to admit, a reasonably intelligent plan. It would have worked on someone who had spent the past 18 months being emotionally reactive instead of quietly watching. I arrived at the faculty club that Saturday evening in a dark green dress I had owned for 3 years and never worn because Marcus always said it made me look severe. I wore it deliberately. I drove myself. I told Marcus I would meet him there because I had an errand to run first, and he accepted that without question, which told me everything about how relaxed he felt going into that evening. The faculty club smelled like warm wood and candle wax and the particular faint mustiness of a building that has hosted important occasions for decades and absorbed some of each one into its walls. Round tables in the private dining room, white linen, silver candlesticks, the soft murmur of guests already drinking wine and standing in easy clusters near the windows. I recognized almost everyone. Marcus's department chair and his wife, 2 of Gloria's oldest friends from the board, a senior research partner named Tom, who had known Marcus since graduate school, and always called me the planner, with a kind of affectionate respect that I genuinely valued. Marcus saw me come in and crossed the room to kiss my cheek. "You look wonderful," he said. His eyes were calm, practiced. I smiled and said thank you, and let him take my coat and guide me toward the nearest group of guests with his hand light at my back. And I thought about the word timeline, and I breathed steadily, and I waited. Gloria caught my eye from across the room and raised her glass slightly in my direction. A small, gracious gesture, the kind a person makes when they believe the evening is already decided. I raised mine back, and I thought, not yet. The dinner itself lasted almost 2 hours before Gloria finally moved. I had been watching her the entire time, the way you watch a sky that has been building pressure all afternoon. And I noticed the exact moment she shifted from hostess into something else. Her posture changed. Her attention stopped circulating and focused. She set her fork down with the particular quiet deliberateness of someone who has decided the moment has arrived. She tapped the side of her glass once. The room settled immediately, the way rooms do when the person tapping is someone people are used to obeying without quite noticing they are doing it. "I would like to say a few words," she began, "about what 15 years really means." The table smiled warmly. Someone near the far end said, "Hear, hear," in the easy way people do when they think a toast is coming. Marcus was looking at his plate. That detail lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. Not the betrayal itself, but the smallness of that gesture, the way he could not even hold his eyes up for this part. Gloria's voice was measured and warm as she spoke about commitment and the meaning of family and the importance of honesty between people who share a life. She was good at this, genuinely good, the kind of speaker who makes you trust the container before you realize what is inside it. She built it slowly, sentence by sentence, until the room was leaning gently in her direction without knowing it had moved at all. Then she reached beside her chair and lifted a manila envelope. "There are some things," she said, "that a family has a responsibility to address openly, even when it is painful to do so." And I watched every face at the table shift from warmth to uncertainty in the span of about 4 seconds. She opened the envelope and began removing documents, and the room tilted, and Marcus still did not look up, and for one long and very human moment, I felt the full weight of what it means to be the subject of something carefully prepared against you by people who know exactly which audience to perform it in front of. Then I reached into my bag and placed my own folder on the table. Nobody at that table moved. Not one person reached for their wine or shifted in their chair or made the small social sounds people usually make to fill uncomfortable silence. They just stared at the folder I had placed on the white linen between the silverware and the candlelight. And the room held its breath, like a building holding itself together in wind. Gloria recovered first. She always recovered first. That was her particular skill. The ability to absorb an unexpected development and immediately begin reframing it before anyone else had finished processing what they had seen. She smiled, not warmly now, but with the controlled patience of someone who believes the situation is still manageable, and said that she was not sure what I thought I was doing, but that this was a family evening, and perhaps some things were better discussed privately. I said, very calmly, that I agreed completely, that private would have been my preference too, but that unfortunately the conversation had already been made public, and so it seemed fair that everyone present should have access to the complete picture rather than just one carefully selected portion of it. I opened the folder and slid the first document toward the center of the table. It was the property registration. One page, clean and official and completely legible from several seats away. Marcus's name at the top as sole owner of a commercial real estate venture registered 14 months earlier. Gloria's name 3 lines below as co-investor and co-signatory on the initial funding structure. Tom, the senior research partner sitting directly across from me, leaned forward slightly without meaning to. I watched his expression change the way water changes when something heavy drops into it. First the impact, then the slow spreading rings. Gloria's documents were still spread across her side of the table, the transfers she had flagged as suspicious. The implication that I had been moving shared money for my own purposes, and now, sitting directly beside them, the registration showing that Marcus and his mother had incorporated a private venture using funds drawn from accounts we both legally owned, without my knowledge, without my signature, without a single conversation. The juxtaposition did not need explanation. It explained itself. Marcus finally looked up. His face had the particular quality of someone watching 2 cars move toward each other on a narrow road, and understanding there is nothing left to do but wait for the sound. He looked at the registration document. Then he looked at me. And for the first time in our marriage, I saw something in his expression that was not performance or charm or carefully maintained composure. It was the look of a person who has just realized that the story they were telling had a different ending than the one they had prepared for. He said my name once. Just my name, nothing after it. Like a sentence that ran out of words before it finished forming. I did not answer him. I turned to page 7 instead. Page 7 was the forensic accountant's summary. 1 page, precise and unemotional, laying out the full timeline of financial activity across our joint accounts over the past 20 months. Every transfer I had made listed with its corresponding documentation. Every transfer Marcus had made listed with its corresponding destination. The numbers did not argue. They simply existed, in sequence, the way facts do when nobody has edited them. Gloria said something about context, that financial arrangements in a marriage were complex, and that documents without explanation could be misleading to people unfamiliar with the full situation. It was a reasonable thing to say. It would have carried weight if the room had not already seen both sets of documents side by side. Marcus's department chair, a quiet man named Professor Ellis, who had always struck me as someone who listened more carefully than he spoke, set his wineglass down with a small, precise sound and said nothing. But he pulled the forensic summary toward him and read it slowly from the top, and the silence around him while he read felt louder than anything anyone had said aloud. I sat still and let the documents speak. That had always been Janet's advice. Let the paper talk. Your job is just to make sure it gets into the room. What I had not fully prepared myself for was the grief that arrived alongside the clarity. Not for Marcus, exactly. Not for the marriage I was watching come apart at that table. But for the specific loss of the version of my life I had believed I was living for 15 years. That life had not been entirely false. There had been real mornings in it, real laughter, real moments of ease and warmth, and the ordinary comfort of knowing someone's habits so well you can set a cup of coffee on their desk without asking how they take it. Those things had been real. It was only their foundation that had not been. And sitting at that candlelit table with 22 people going very still around me, I felt the strange double weight of winning something and losing something at exactly the same moment. Gloria stood from her chair. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness now cost her something. You could hear the effort in it, the way you hear effort in a door being held open against strong wind. She said that the evening had taken an unfortunate turn and that she thought it best if we all took a moment. No one moved to follow her lead. That was when I understood the evening had already shifted completely beyond her control. Because the people at that table were not just witnesses to a family argument. Several of them were professional colleagues who had built their own reputations on sound judgment. And sound judgment, once activated, is very difficult to redirect with a smile and a suggestion to take a moment. Tom looked at Marcus directly and asked one question, just one. He asked whether the property venture had been funded with jointly held assets before any legal separation agreement was in place. The silence that followed that question was the loudest thing I had ever heard inside a quiet room. And Marcus, who had spent 15 years being the most charming and fluent person in every conversation he entered, opened his mouth and said nothing at all. Marcus's silence lasted exactly long enough to end his marriage, his professional reputation, and his mother's carefully constructed social world all at once. Tom did not ask the question again. He did not need to. The silence was its own answer, and every person at that table understood it with the particular clarity that comes when you watch someone choose not to lie simply because they have finally run out of convincing lies to tell. Professor Ellis set the forensic summary down with the same quiet precision with which he had picked it up. Gloria remained standing, but something in her posture had changed. The architecture of her confidence, always so immaculate, was visibly bearing weight it had not been designed to carry. I did not feel triumphant. That surprised me. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and somewhere in that preparation, I think I had imagined feeling something sharp and satisfying when it arrived. Instead, what I felt was closer to the strange flatness that follows a very loud sound. Not emptiness exactly, more like the moment after, when the air is still rearranging itself and you are simply standing in it, breathing. Marcus finally spoke. He said that the venture had been structured to protect shared assets during a period of professional uncertainty. He said it carefully, the way a person speaks when they are constructing a sentence in real time and testing each word before committing to it. He said he had intended to bring me into the full picture once the structure was more stable. Tom looked at him for a long moment without expression. Then he said quietly that he hoped Marcus had good legal representation, because the financial review his firm would be requesting on Monday morning would require complete documentation of all asset movements connected to any jointly funded project. The word Monday landed on the table like something physical. Gloria sat down. She did it slowly, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked her age. Not in a cruel way, just in the way that people do when the effort of performing strength becomes suddenly too expensive to maintain. She looked at the documents still spread across the white linen, and I watched her understand, in real time, that the narrative she had spent months constructing had not simply failed, it had reversed completely. Every guest she had invited as a witness to my supposed dishonesty was now a witness to something else entirely. I gathered my folder, straightened the pages carefully, and closed it. I did not make a speech. I did not summarize what had happened or explain what it meant. The documents had done that already, and anything I added would only have diluted it. I looked at Marcus once before I stood, not with anger, not even with the sadness I had expected to feel, just with the clear and settled gaze of a person who has finished a very long and exhausting piece of work and is ready to go home. He looked back at me, and in his face I saw something I had never seen there before. Not remorse for the plan, not regret for the money or the venture or the years of careful misdirection. What I saw was simpler and sadder than any of that. He looked like a man who had just understood, too late and too publicly, that he had dismantled the only genuinely solid thing in his life with his own hands, and that no amount of charm or strategy or his mother's careful management would ever put it back together again. I picked up my bag. I thanked the staff near the door the way I always did, because that had nothing to do with Marcus or Gloria or any of it. Then I walked out of the faculty club into the cool night air and stood on the stone steps for just a moment, breathing. The street was quiet. Amber streetlights reflected off wet pavement from earlier rain. Somewhere down the block, a door opened briefly, releasing warm light and the sound of ordinary conversation, then closed again. I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove home through streets that looked exactly the same as they always had. Which was, I realized, exactly the point. The world does not reorganize itself around your private upheavals. It simply continues, and you find your place in its continuation. I did not cry that night. I made tea, sat at my kitchen table with the folder in front of me, and thought about the word timeline, the one I had heard Gloria use in the coffee shop all those weeks ago. She had been so certain about her timeline, so confident in the sequence she had built and the ending she had planned for it. The thing about other people's timelines is that they only work if you agree to follow them. The separation agreement was finalized over the following months through Janet's office, without a single courtroom appearance. Marcus did not contest the asset division once the full financial documentation was submitted formally. He could not. The property venture was restructured under legal review, and a portion of the proceeds from its eventual sale was returned to our joint holdings as part of the settlement. It was not a dramatic financial victory. It was simply accurate, which was all I had ever wanted it to be. Gloria withdrew from 2 of her 3 board commitments quietly, without public announcement. I heard this from a colleague who mentioned it in passing without knowing any of the context. She said Gloria had cited personal reasons. I did not respond to that. There was nothing useful to say. What I had not expected in the months that followed was how much space opened up inside my life once I stopped filling it with vigilance. For over a year, I had been watching and documenting and preparing, holding myself at a particular angle of alertness that had become so normal, I had stopped noticing how much energy it was consuming. When that tension finally released, the relief was almost physical. Like setting down a bag you have been carrying so long you forgot it was in your hand. I moved into a smaller apartment near the water, a place with large windows and morning light that came in at an angle I had not planned for and turned out to love completely. I kept working. I took on a city project I had been circling for 2 years without committing to. A green infrastructure proposal for a neighborhood that genuinely needed it. The kind of work that reminded me why I had chosen this field in the first place. Not because it was prestigious, because it was useful. My friend Clara, who had watched the whole thing unfold from the periphery with the careful concern of someone who knew better than to offer opinions before they were requested, came to help me paint the living room on a Saturday afternoon. We put on old music and opened all the windows, and she did not ask me how I was feeling in the careful way people do when they expect a complicated answer. She just handed me a roller and said the color I had chosen was excellent and that she was staying for dinner. That evening, with paint still on my hands and the windows open to the smell of evening air off the water, I thought about what it had actually cost me and what it had given back. The cost was real. 15 years is not a small thing to grieve, and I was still grieving parts of it, probably would be for a while longer. Grief does not run on a schedule, and it does not respond well to being reasoned with. But what had come back was something I had not fully realized I had surrendered. The simple and foundational experience of trusting my own judgment. Of knowing that when I looked at a situation clearly and formed a conclusion, that conclusion was reliable. Marcus and Gloria had worked very hard for a very long time to make me question that reliability, to make me feel that my readings of situations were slightly off, slightly emotional, slightly less accurate than the readings of people who had more experience or more authority, or more confidence in their own voices. That is the quietest and most effective form of control there is. Not cruelty, not force. Just the slow, patient erosion of a person's faith in their own perception. And what I want to say to anyone listening who recognizes any part of that is this. A person who needs you slightly off balance to feel comfortable around you is not someone who loves you. They are someone who needs an audience they can manage. And the moment you stop being manageable, you will see exactly who they always were. That clarity, once it arrives, does not leave. It changes the way you move through every room after that. Not with suspicion, with knowledge. And knowledge, held quietly and used carefully, is the most durable thing a person can carry. Now, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. Have you ever stayed in a relationship, a marriage, a friendship, a family dynamic, longer than you should have? Not because you did not see what was happening, but because seeing it clearly meant you had to do something about it. And doing something about it felt more frightening than staying? Tell me in the comments, because I think more people know exactly what that feeling is than will ever admit it out loud. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe. There are more stories coming, and the next one is one you will not want to miss.